All right, so today marks the 77th anniversary of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, otherwise known as NATO, and President Trump is now threatening to take the U.S. out of it over its refusal to join the war with Iran. Trump told The Telegraph, quote, "I was never swayed by NATO. I always thought they were a paper tiger, and Putin knows that too, by the way." This comes as NATO Secretary General is scheduled to travel to the White House on Wednesday. Both the White House and NATO have said that the meeting was planned long before Trump's threats. Joining us now is former U.S. Ambassador to NATO, Ivo Daalder. Ambassador, it's great to have you with us. Thank you so much for joining us on the show. You say this is the worst crisis NATO has faced in its 77 years. Why do you say that, and how do you expect this meeting between Trump and the NATO Secretary General to go?
Well, never before in the 77-year history of this alliance has a president of the United States not only hinted, but actually directly said that he wants to withdraw from this alliance. He has also said that, as far as he's concerned, the European allies should not count on the United States anymore when it comes to the question of war. They were not there for us, he argues, and therefore we won't be there for them. That is a major change. That is a significant crisis in and of itself. But more worrisome is that many European allies are now no longer trusting the United States and indeed seeing the possibility of being caught in a war that they neither were consulted on nor were asked to participate on when it started. They're starting to say, wait a minute, this is an unnecessary war. It's an illegal war. We don't want to be a part of it. And they're denying, in some cases, the transfer of certain equipments, including Patriot weapon systems, or basing the ability to base aircraft and fly through the airspace of other countries. Those are challenges that we haven't seen, and you wouldn't have seen this but for the fact of how the president went to war and the reality that a lot of countries no longer think the United States is a reliable ally.
Ambassador, Trump is also facing some blowback, as you pointed out, from other members of the alliance. French President Emmanuel Macron mounted a defense of NATO this week, saying, quote, "I believe organizations and alliances like NATO are defined by what is left unsaid. That is the trust that underpins them. If you cast doubt on your commitment every day, you erode its very substance." How significant are comments like that, and what do you think the implications are?
You know, I think they're very significant. I think it's a truism that the trust has been broken between the United States, this administration, at the very least, and our European and Canadian allies. And as anyone who's either participated in or observed a breakup of an important relationship, say a marriage, when trust is broken, it's very hard to put it back together. Not impossible, but it is very hard. So I think President Macron saying out loud what, in fact, many people are thinking is important. But he's hardly alone. And noteworthy is the fact that Prime Minister Keir Starmer, who talked about a lot of noise as a way to sort of dismiss the Telegraph interview that you just quoted up the top of the story, then said, but, you know, in the future, we need to have a much closer relationship economically and in security terms with the European Union and with the Europeans. That is not something that British Prime Ministers have generally said in the past. Yes, they want a close relationship with the Europeans, but within NATO, not somehow separately. We have seen others, including the Chancellor Merz, saying that the Pax Americana, the days in which the United States led the world, is over, that we need to be increasingly independent from the United States. So we have major leaders in Europe, as well as, of course, the Prime Minister of Canada, who in Davos came out loud and said there was a rupture in the international order, a rupture caused by the United States. We have major allies saying we can no longer trust the United States. And this war coming after a major conflict over the issue of Greenland, when the United States, or President Trump, said that he would like to make sure that Greenland became part of the United States, was willing to use force to do so. Greenland is a part of NATO. So under those circumstances, this has not been a great year, 2026, for the health of the alliance and the challenges we're all living with now.
Ambassador, I want you to take a listen to what then Senator Marco Rubio used to sound like when he spoke of NATO.
It's an important alliance. If NATO didn't exist, we'd have to create it. It's one of our strategic strengths that we have in the world. I don't believe Donald Trump will remove us from NATO.
After this conflict is concluded, we are going to have to re-examine that relationship. We're going to have to re-examine the value of NATO and that alliance for our country.
So you first see him speaking there in 2024. It ends there with him in present day. What do you make of that? I mean, Secretary Rubio has been in this game. He has done this work for a really long time. He understands these relationships. I believe that's probably why he supported them and understood the gravity not that long ago. So how do you read his flip-flop on NATO? And not just his flip-flop on it, but also his role in the dismantling, the fraying of these relationships?
Yeah, I think one of the reasons I'm more concerned that we are at a crisis point than just having Donald Trump, who's really never liked NATO. He's always been against it. He's always seen it as more of a burden than a benefit. He's either not understood or just dismissed the value that people like Marco Rubio until very recently believed NATO had, and the value that I still believe NATO has, which is that this is an alliance that for 77 years has kept the peace in Europe. And if you keep the peace in Europe, it means you don't have to go to war in Europe, which is what we did in World War I and World War II at far greater cost to our lives and treasure than the cost of being part of an alliance system. You know, Marco Rubio will have to explain for himself why he changes his mind. I do think it's important that in 2023 he led the effort to sponsor an amendment that was passed and signed into law of the National Defense Authorization Act, which says that a president cannot withdraw from NATO unless there's a two-thirds consent of the Senate. The constitutionality of that law is questionable, but the sentiment is not. And at the time he said, I think it's very important, he said no president, and I assume that that includes the current president, should be in a position to withdraw from NATO. And yet now we are hearing him saying that maybe we need to reassess it. And that's why I'm worried. We have the Secretary of State, who's also the National Security Advisor, talking in the same way as the president. We have the Secretary of Defense refusing, as he did 2 days ago or 3 days ago, to answer a question whether the United States would still fulfill Article 5, which is the collective defense arrangement of this alliance. It's worrisome that we have people at the top of our power in the executive branch who are raising serious questions about our alliance that has kept the peace in a continent that has only known war when it came to the first half of the last century. So it's a dire state that we're in.
Ambassador, quick final question. How high are the stakes as you see it when the NATO secretary comes and meets with President Trump this week at the White House? Does he need to extract some sort of formal verbal commitment that Donald Trump still believes and supports the alliance?
You know, it would be nice if Mark Rutte, who is the Trump whisperer among all Trump whisperers, is able to get the president to say that. But I think it's important to note that it doesn't really matter what the president says anymore. He has made very, very clear that he doesn't think that NATO has done what it needs to do. He's wrong about that. Many bases and many places are being used to fight this war, without which this war would not be able to be fought. He never talks about that. But more importantly, he's raised too many questions for allies to be comfortable, no matter what he says on Wednesday in a meeting with the Secretary General of NATO.
Ambassador, I'm going to get in trouble for this, but one last question. Sorry. To play devil's advocate here, what do you make of the French tanker being allowed to pass through the Strait of Hormuz, and that the French are now basically negotiating with the Iranians, or have come to some agreement with the Iranians, to allow French vessels to pass through? Do you think that in itself undercuts the North Atlantic alliance, that the European countries are going to be looking out for their own self-interest? Not participating in the war is one thing, but basically going along with whatever Iran is setting as conditions to pass through the Strait of Hormuz seems to be another thing that could anger the Americans.
Yeah, a lot of things that can anger the Americans, but countries that have their own national self-interest, they need to pursue those self-interests. Their ships are bottled up, and this container ship has been bottled up in the Gulf for months, for weeks, and it needed to get out. And here's the problem. Last time I looked, on the 28th of February, the Strait of Hormuz was open. traffic was going back and forth. We started to bomb. That's why it's closed. And now we're spending all of our time figuring out how to open a strait that was open before we bombed. You've got to wonder whether this was the right thing to do.
Ambassador Ivo Daalder, thank you so much. Good to have you.
My pleasure.